Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure and honor to be here to share with you my thoughts on the 40 years of reform and opening up in China and the future of our industry. I started investing into China here in Shanghai in 1985. And that 34 years was really a very fruitful experience for myself. And I have participated, participated into the reform process. And I've been asked advice on what the government should be doing. And I've also had the good fortune of working with quite a few of the leaders when they were in various positions. And so today I'm sharing with you my observation and thoughts on the reform process. China, back in 1978, was one of the poorest countries in the world. And this is what I'm trying to cover, I'm sorry. The per capita GDP was only $156 US, and it was only about 2.5% of the global economy. But by 2017, the GDP per capita was 8,827 US, and 15% of the global economy. That is quite remarkable, and the average growth rate has been close to 10% over those 40 years. And I still remember many, many times, a lot of my Western friends would be saying, the crash is coming in China, but it never happened. Why? I'm going to share with you some of my thoughts. So what are the features that distinguish China's rapid development from the other countries? In my mind, the most distinctive attribute of China's reform and opening up is the pragmatic and gradual approach, or the crossing the river by feeling the stone. The economic strategy actually began at the grassroots level by improving the lives of the rural population with the household contract responsibility system. It's really more like a contract system that they started with, which is encouraging the peasants to set up and run collective light industry enterprises, making products like clothing, toys, and necessities. Then in 1979, China set up the special economic zones, the 4 special economic zones, Shenzhen, Zhuhai, Shantou. And by means of the 3+1, the 3+1 production and trade model, which is bringing in the material, the design, and the samples, and then doing the custom manufacturing in China. Chinese foreign equity joint ventures were set up, and then even wholly owned foreign joint ventures. China was able to attract capital, technology, and management from overseas, and which is helping to modernize the Chinese industries and helping it to integrate with the world. But this actually not only started with just the coastal region, it very quickly spread to the inland provinces as well. And then in 1992, Deng Xiaoping proposed a socialist market economy system, wanting to strengthen the role of the business and hoping to improve the people's livelihood. But all the members of the Communist Party were very, very opposed to it, saying that market economy is actually a product of the capitalist system. But then Deng Xiaoping used a very, very simple phrase. He said, whether it's a black cat or white cat, as long as it catches the mice, it's a good cat. So it's amazing that Deng Xiaoping can use such simple language to illustrate the point and get across to the man in the street. And then in 1986, China started to apply for the re-entry to the GATT the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And after 15 years of negotiation, China formally entered the WTO in 2001. And following China's entry, the country not only entered a new era of external economic cooperation and trade and further integrated into the global economy, it also quickly became a crucial part of the global supply chain as the world's factory. In 1978, China only exported 9.8 billion in goods, expanding to more than 2.3 trillion in 2017, which is 230 times increase. China was ranked 30th in the world in terms of export in 1980, and since 2009, China consistently occupied the first place by a wide margin. China's rapid economic development since 2000 can be attributed to the Chinese government's effective banking reform and handling of the non-performing assets. The Chinese government initiated the reform of the state-owned commercial banks in 1994, trying to separate the policy-related and the commercial banking. Then around the year 2000, a huge number of non-performing loans were left from legacy problems of a planned economy, and many state-owned commercial banks were actually technically bankrupt. And in 1999, the Chinese government decided to take these non-performing assets off the books of the major state-owned banks, which is the ICBC, Industrial and Commercial Bank, and then the Agricultural Bank, Bank of China, and Construction Bank. They established special asset management vehicles, the four of them, China Cinda, China Huarong, Great Wall, and China Orient. And then they further transformed the four state-owned banks into joint stock commercial banks, which they planned for listing. And if you think about it, it's actually not so simple because you're crossing from one system to another to tackle multiple problems. And also for listing, for the state-owned banks, they don't have the rules and the regulations that allow them to do it. So for listing, the Chinese government has to provide for new regulations for the state-owned banks. So between 2005 and 2006, Bank of China, China Construction Bank, and ICBC successfully listed in Hong Kong, not only raising sufficient capital, but also they raised their standard of governance, accountability, risk management, and transparency. And of course now, you probably all know, ICBC is the largest bank in the world in terms of both assets and profitability. As the macroeconomic standards and globalization increased, China also realized that its opening up strategy needed to adapt to the times as excess production and wealth accumulated. So the going out to invest was adopted as a policy in the 15th five-year plan. And now that the Chinese economy has evolved to a new stage, from seeking rapid growth to focusing on quality and efficiency, a change in the economic structure and growth model is needed to unleash the new momentum. Then the Belt and Road Initiative proposed in 2013 is very much the new wave of globalization and going out, based on the concept of creating shared benefits from doing business together and building a future together. The core of the Belt and Road is building infrastructural connectivity, developing resources, and cooperating across all aspects, from finance, trade, to production. Then looking at the 40 years of reform, China adopted a unique step-by-step model. Explore boldly, advance prudently. First, you experiment, then summarize the results, and then promote and expand. But what is important is that China has persevered and did not deviate from its overall direction in reforming and opening up. Although it needs to make adjustments to respond to external conditions, the basic concept of opening up remains firm. And looking at the approaches to economic reform, China's approach of crossing the river by feeling the stone is starkly different from the shock therapy of some of the other countries. In the 1990s, Russia implemented drastic reform in a very short time. It discarded all its state-owned economy, abolished economic planning, and completely let go of the price control and privatized all the enterprises. The result was that the total value of Russia's GDP fell by almost half. Of course, China's reform model also did have problems. For example, in the middle of the 90s, in implementing enterprise reform, underperforming small and medium-sized enterprises reorganized, sold, or even closed down. Such measure brought about high unemployment and impacting on social stability. And in some places, the restructuring process was unregulated and far from transparent, and unfair situations did appear. Nonetheless, given a country so vast with such a big population, the reform process, I think, can be considered relatively stable. In facing the problems that appear in the course of reform, China was able to actively respond. Dealing with the non-performing loans held by the state-owned banks is a very good example. And following changes in the domestic and international environment, China's strategy of opening up to the outside has enabled it to keep up with the times. And from the processes of bringing in to going out to the Belt and Road Initiative, these shows that China's reform policy are constantly evolving based on changes around the world. And now we're coming to our own industry, the real estate industry. What has happened in the past, and what do I think will happen in the future? This is what I'm trying to cover, but I only have about 5 minutes, so I'll be very quick. As you can see from this chart, the real estate sector is a very important component of the GDP, right? The highest real estate investment was in 2013, 15.1%, and last year was 13.4%. But the total sales transaction of the commercial residential last year was 17 trillion, which is a very substantial part of the whole GDP for China. And then the completed for sale area, housing area, as you can see, it's close to 1.5 trillion square meters. And this is, I think, just phenomenal figure that it's difficult for people to grasp how big it is. And then if you look at the per capita living space of Chinese residents, 1998 was only 18.7 square meters. 2018 is 40. Why did I compare to 1998 figure? Because 1998 was the year China stopped the allocation of housing for everybody. So it's actually just 20 years. And last year, 30 of the top Chinese developers have sales of over 100 billion RMB each. In Hong Kong, the biggest developer, Sun Hung Kai and Cheung Kong, both had sales of probably about 50 billion Hong Kong dollars. So by comparison, in 20 years, a lot of giants have been built up. I think that shows the entrepreneurial spirit of the Chinese business people, and also the market potential was right there. And unfortunately, the Chinese government intervened with the market quite substantially. And right now, because of the very quick increased price in the last few years, now you have restriction on pricing, restriction on mortgage, restriction on purchase criteria, and then also you have to qualify as a taxpayer or whatever before you can go and buy a unit. And in a lot of cities, you're only allowed to own one unit. So all these are really intervening with the market and interfering with the growth of the industry. But still, as you can see, so many developers have grown so rapidly. And that's quite amazing. And I have to admit myself that we are falling behind. And later on, I'll share with you my thoughts on this. And I believe going forward, the long-term development will be a twin track, the rental and then the purchases. But the rental market is more difficult because the government will have to allocate the land purely for rental housing, which means that the land value will be much lower. And a lot of Chinese municipalities actually depend on land revenue. So that's something that in the future, the government will have to try and balance, right? Over 30, 40% of the government revenue comes from land. So how do you balance that? And then rental housing. I myself would not dare touch it because, first of all, the rental yield is very low. And then secondly, you will never be able to evict your tenants, even if they don't pay. So that's something we will all have to think about. And then longer term, I believe with the rapid growth in the economy and the changes that are taking place, I think it still offers a lot of opportunities for innovative and creative developers, hopefully like Shui On Land. So you've seen just now we got an award for the KIC. It's modeled after the Silicon Valley. And I built that project, started building that project 15 years ago, before the government was advocating entrepreneurship and innovation. Why? Because I believe that's where the economy would need to go to. Otherwise, how do you maintain that growth momentum? So in China, if you know what is coming, and if you can project, I think there's still lots of opportunities. And just now I was talking about the residential market. There's no way we can compete with the local developers because within 6 to 9 months of buying the land, they already start selling. And that's the time when we're only just about to submit our plans for approval. So the quick turn. And then also another element that we have to be aware of is the land appreciation tax, which is very, very substantial. The maximum is 50%. So in all my projects, we're paying over 70% in tax alone. So that's why we're now wanting to devote ourselves to the developer, owner, and management of commercial properties. We keep them for long term, so we don't have to pay the LAT. On the residential side, which is, I think, also important because if we just focus on doing the commercial, the payback period is way too long. So we want to get the residential land, but we want to work with local developers, people who can produce the quality that we can accept. We work with them, let them do the quick turn, and then we focus on doing what we know best. And for overseas developers, I think you need to come in and really look at the market where you can really create a niche for yourself. There's still plenty of opportunities because the growth and also the rapid changes in the city. Like Shanghai, I've been here for 34 years, but it's still changing rapidly. Shanghai aspires to become an international finance center like New York, London. So there's still a lot that they need to do to upgrade themselves. So in the Hongqiao area, I believe that's going to be the next growth area. But what do you do there? How do you build? How do you plan? I think these are issues that are interesting, exciting, but at the same time, very challenging. Maybe I'll stop there and invite Tom to come up and we can have a dialogue.
I'm humbled to be up here. You know, there's a lot of people in this audience would like to question you, you know, because you've seen the future. In Xintiandi 20 years ago, when people were knocking everything down, you saw the value of historic property as a centerpiece for a new development. What was it like trying to convince the government to do something brand new, and what has it been like in other cities in Fushan and Wuhan where you've done things like that?
I think the Shanghai Xintiandi, I can almost say I probably would have a nervous breakdown, if I should think about it, because it's right next to the first Congress Hall of the Communist Party. So if I were building something like a Xintiandi 20-odd years ago, I was very, very concerned whether the older members would accept that. So building it, I was worried that the moment some of these older members come in, they don't like it, then I have to tear it down. So what I did was I employed one of the government officials to work with us and help me promote the concept of the Xintiandi to them. And we built, for example, sort of like a showcase for them. This is what it will be like. And making sure that the business that will be conducted in Xintiandi will be all legitimate and above board.
So what we're seeing all across the country now is that historic preservation has become a major part of the conversation about what China is going to look like in the future.
Yes.
And I think it's a good story. The second where you saw the future is what you just mentioned, the technology center that you developed. And I want to ask you that because what we've seen, thank you, what we've seen is that in many places in the world now, technology is the driver of real estate. And in America, China, over the last 6 or 7 years, has become the second largest venture capital market. So you're watching innovation. And what are you seeing with that on the impact of real estate?
Well, right now, because the central government is so determined to push entrepreneurship and innovation, so a lot of people are trying to copy what we've done in KIC, but they haven't been able to create that ecosystem. It's not just the hardware.
Right.
It's the ecosystem.
Right.
How do you actually help support the young people? And also, how do you actually get them to be able to have a higher success rate?
That's a great, because the question of availability of venture capital, and you've made that, obviously figured out how to make that available in the development. Talk a little bit about how that has happened.
Actually, 15 years ago, inside China, I think very few people know about the startups and what they have to try and do. And at that time, I was often going to Silicon Valley, and then I knew that the Silicon Valley Bank was the biggest bank in the US supporting all the startups and the venture capitals. So I talked to Silicon Valley Bank, invite them to come to Shanghai.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
And Silicon Valley Bank now has a joint venture in Shanghai, but at that time, their bank size is not big enough to get a license themselves. But I helped them set up, and then they help us also get the whole ecosystem building.
It's a remarkable story.
Yes.
So I can't let this pass. Our illustrious president. What is the impact of real estate? Is it short term, or this conversation going on between China and the U.S., is it going to have longer term impact?
Well,
it depends on our election, I guess.
I think the property business in China should thank President Trump, because with the slowdown of the economy here in China, the government is sort of relaxing on the restrictions on purchases. So actually, if you look at the figures last month, there was a big upsurge.
In real estate?
In real estate purchases.
That's interesting.
So
I don't know that we're hearing about
because,
that.
Because actually, real estate property is the biggest domestic consumption in China. Just now I mentioned 16%.
So it's actually becoming easier to develop right now?
Easier to do development
That's
at
really
this stage.
interesting.
But I'm actually still very worried about the Sino-US relations going forward. And the trade war, I believe, is just a precursor.
Well,
there's going to be a lot of other problems to deal with.
No, so we have a couple questions from the audience. Let me ask one. Until now, it seems China was developing China's own interests. We'll be able to think truly globally and be honestly concerned with international issues.
Well, I think the Belt and Road Initiative is a very good example. I know the U.S. is dead against it, but the last 4 years I've been working so hard on it when I was chairman of the Hong Kong Trade Development Council, because I believe China cannot do the Belt and Road on its own. Simply, first of all, they can't afford it. Secondly, it's not politically feasible. So I believe that Hong Kong can become that commercial hub, that platform to bring in all the resources from around the world to go to the Belt and Road. And that's, I think, a very important part of global cooperation, right? There's now 131 countries that sign on to the Belt and Road.
Is that right?
Yes.
And you're, I know, very engaged with that.
Yes, yes.
And so you see that not only weaving the world together more, but creating huge
and what's
economic
important,
opportunities.
Tom, is that it's helping the developing countries or some of the third world countries, right? You're bringing connectivity to them. You're also helping them set up their industries, just like China 40 years ago.
Right. Building the infrastructure.
Yes.
Let me ask you this as a difficult question. What's your view of the political tensions between China and the Hong Kong, considering the recent extradition protests and its implications on the property market? And maybe we'll, are you comfortable?
Well, it's, I can't say very much about it because I'm not sure if a lot of the members here know too much about the extradition law. But it's very sad. I think the Hong Kong government hasn't done a good job. They took it for granted that this will be passed. So there was not too much explanation and introduction to the community. And all of a sudden, it came in, and people are worried that, okay, if the extradition law is there, then China can ask for a lot of the people who might have committed certain crimes to go back to China.
So you're being copied all over China with Xintiandi type developments, many smaller, in many different places. Do you think they're all going to succeed?
Unfortunately, no. I still haven't seen anything that's acceptable in my mind.
What do you think is the mix of magic sauce that makes Xintiandi and Wuhan Tiandi that we've seen? What's the magic sauce? And maybe that's secret. You don't want to give it away like Coca-Cola. I don't know.
Tom, I think it's a lot of hard work, and labor with my whole team. I was on site every day. We make sure that all the quality is right up to standard. And then also, you have to be able to really grasp what is the future trend of this community. Right? At that time, my Shanghai friends were telling me, we Shanghai people will never eat or drink outdoor. But if you go to Xintiandi now, those are the places that are all occupied first.
So do you have good economists and futurists on your team that are sort of seeing the future?
Yes. No, and I myself work on that quite a bit.
And you travel a lot. And
I travel a lot, and also I'm very keen on studying development of countries and cities.
And so what do you think the next generation of the Xintiandis in China, what are you seeing as hints of that? Maybe it's your technology development.
No, I'm seeing a combination of the KIC with the Xintiandi. Live, work, play, learn.
So the university becomes a centerpiece.
No, not just university. Right. Learning is actually, even if you're just meeting your friends, there's learning there. Right? And I think there's a lot that this sort of community can provide for these people. So it's more than just a social destination.
Right. And as you know, that is really the trend in the United States also right now, and in Europe, is that people want that kind of sense of community of place. The world can't move forward with its environmental programs unless China comes on board. Your thoughts on what China is doing, and I think over the last 10 years has been a remarkable embrace of the environmental and climate change issues.
I believe the Chinese government will continue to do that because they recognize that the pollutions in Shanghai and all these other cities are just not acceptable. And I think with affluence, they can afford to do it, and they will do it, right? And you can see in Shanghai, the government actually pay a very high price to buy back some of the houses and turn them into small open space within the city.
Mm-hmm. And what do you see the environmental regulations do you see impacting real estate? For example, solar. Do you see the government beginning to require more in developments, more solar and other green buildings, smart buildings?
That's only logical. I think it will all come in step by step.
And the other big environmental, are you seeing changes in land use because of climate change and rising, not only the sea, but when we have rains now, we're seeing the rivers flood in ways that they've never flooded before. Are you facing that because some of your developments have been on water?
Well, we don't really deal with the rivers, but I'm sure that's very high on the minds of the government. But on city planning, there's going to be change because, like in Shanghai, for example, in the city itself, the FAR is so low. And I always advocate to the government, you're wasting your precious resources, right? So they're now going to relax on that and build higher plot ratios.
So you're seeing that beginning to happen.
That's happening.
And the other big issue in China really is the whole issue of and we saw with the questions, the whole reform of the financial system. How do you see that playing out?
I think the internationalization of the renminbi will continue, but under the current political environment in the world, I am not confident that we will see the free convertibility of the renminbi within a short time. But I think that the government definitely is working towards that. And I think that will happen. It's only a matter of time. And actually, I have a crazy suggestion for the government to consider is, why can't we use Hong Kong dollars in some of the special economic zones, right? Hong Kong dollars is freely convertible.
And it's acceptable, right.
Instead of just one country, two systems, it can be one country, two currencies.
So we talked about the technology. And so you've described how you attracted venture capital. What other parts of that entrepreneurial culture do you think is critical to grow a community around technology?
Well, I think in China, I don't see that as much of a problem because the young people, they're all very, very sensitive to it and they all love to learn it and play with it. The biggest problem in starting up in China is actually the one-child policy. All parents don't want to see their son or daughter fail. Right. And for startups, over 90% will fail. So it's a matter of educating the right. parents as well. So I've sponsored a course in Fudan University here in Shanghai to also educate the parents.
Oh, you really?
Yes.
So you're seeing entrepreneurial courses that educate students about starting companies.
No, you have to educate the parents that, okay, there's a big chance of failure, but you have to allow them to try instead of trying to protect them all right. their lives.
And so have you seen also a venture capital community grow in China? So you mentioned going to Silicon Valley and getting Silicon Valley Bank to invest here. Have you seen also?
Yes. It's growing very fast.
So because there's been a huge amount of wealth created, yes. and so you're seeing that
yes.
investment
yes.
back into the
There's no
community.
shortage of funds, but it's just a matter of whether you can have access to it.
And so in your development, how do you showcase young entrepreneurs to be able to get to that venture capital?
Well, that's the ecosystem that we've built up in the knowledge and innovation community there. Once they set up, actually the angel funds are already going around them.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. And were you involved in creating that angel fund? Were you helpful?
I have invested
so
some
it's
myself.
Really part
yes,
of it is your
yes,
commitment
yes,
to
yes,
making this
yes,
work. Because we've seen in places in the United States that venture capital is really the glue that makes technology work.
It makes a lot of sense for us. If we're working there, we see all these young people. We know which one is
right.
more chance of a success.
Right. Well, it's very interesting. Let me see if we have other. I don't see any other questions we have. Finally, let me just end with the future looks very bright. China faces still 800 or 900 million people that are basically in rural areas that want to live like people in Shanghai live. The management of that is such a huge issue. How does it happen?
Well, but in the past 20 years, not 20 years, 40 years, 740 million people were lifted out of poverty.
Right.
Now it's only a very small fraction.
Story.
Yes.
Right.
And I believe the government is focusing on helping these 70 million
So you believe that the success over the last 20 or 25 years, 40 years, will continue in
yes.
absorbing that,
Yes.
that urbanization of China, really, right?
No, because I was a member of the CPPCC. Every year in the government report, in the discussion, always focus on how do you help the poverty people.
Vincent, you're a remarkable man. Thank you for your involvement with ULI, and thank you for being here today.